Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Band 24/7. I am Cody Goodwin here with Mike Rodak. Midweek show, little newsy reaction to the press conferences from Monday. We're recording this on Tuesday morning. Also wanted to get into a media discussion as it pertains to Alabama sports, just kind of the proliferation of former athletes and coaches making their way into our space. And I think I wanted to start there, Mike. We have a little bit of competition in the podcast space now. I don't know if you picked up on this, but Ryan Williams, Jalen Mbakwe, two of the five-star freshmen for Alabama, announced that they have a new podcast now called the New Wave Podcast, where I think they're going to get together weekly, the two of them, and just kind of discuss life as student athletes, as Alabama football players. And they dropped their first episode, 17 minutes on YouTube yesterday. I listened to it. I don't know. Have you caught it? Are you worried about the now super crowded Alabama podcast space?
I thought we were the only one out there to begin with. So that's the only one I care about is ours, right? It's like John Wooden, the only team. He never watched film of the opponent, John Wooden. He just only watched film of UCLA and tried to get his own team better. So that's I think that's the approach that we should take. But no, it's they have that podcast space that they made last year, the whole NIL Advantage Center or whatever it is. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I don't know, like NIL is about paying players directly. I don't know if NIL is about podcast studios, but in this case, I think they're trying to make good use of it. And so they have two players that I think people want to hear from. I feel it's like I have a weird feeling of deja vu with this one. I feel like they've already had a podcast, or there was something about, because they were friends coming in to Alabama, if I remember correctly. I just feel like we've talked about this before in a strange sense. Maybe I've dreamed about it. I don't know, but
You've had some weird dreams lately. So
I have, but yeah, it's the new age where the team itself will create content, and sometimes for NIL purposes too. So it's not just us in the media talking about Alabama; it's Alabama talking about Alabama.
And I think this is cool because it's two athletes, right? And we've seen a lot of athletes dive into the space, right? Like the Kelsey brothers obviously have a super successful podcast. A lot of NBA players, NFL players have latched on with Yahoo and other media entities to produce podcasts and bring you not all the way behind the curtain, but a little bit behind the curtain. And this is something that they want to do, right? Like, I mean, you hit on it. They're very close friends. They actually, one of the things they talked about in their first show was their high schools, Clay Chalkville for Mbakwe and Saraland for Williams, played in the 6A state championship game last year at Bryant-Denny Stadium. So that was one of the topics that they not discussed, but they brought up. And it was, I don't know, like that was kind of interesting. And I think it's kind of cool too. Like these two guys, I think they're very aware that people want to hear a little bit more from them to launch a podcast like this, where clearly there's already a little bit of chemistry. You can sense that they're really good friends when you listen to it. I think it's only on YouTube right now. I hope it comes out on other platforms, because I listen through Apple Podcasts when I listen to all my shows. But you can sense that there's a good friendship, there's a good chemistry between the two, and it'll be kind of interesting to see how it grows and how it evolves. Because I feel like the Kelsey brothers have set a really mean curve when it comes to, like, that's the standard. Like, can this match that? I don't know, but I'm kind of excited to see how it evolves.
I think the Kelsey brothers are good. I've listened to their podcast a couple times, but there's a big reason why a lot of people listen to that podcast, and it has nothing to do with either of them directly. So it's also the reason why I think Amazon just paid, was it 9 figures? I saw was the story.
Something ridiculous like that.
$100 million for their podcast rights. Again, it's not because of Jason or Travis Kelce. It's because of who is in Travis Kelce's life, shall we say.
Taylor Swift. I'll say it. Taylor Swift.
Say it. This is not just a stick to sports podcast.
I listened to the first episode before we hit record here. They obviously, you could tell that this recording was way even before fall camp. Like, this was something that they did a little while ago and are just now rolling it out. So I wonder how frequent these shows are going to be. We'll see.
Hopefully it's better than the Bryce Young podcast from a couple years ago.
They discussed their two college kids just kind of living life on Alabama's campus. They discussed their EA CFB ratings. Like they went back and forth whining about their strength ratings. Jalen Mbakwe believes that he is stronger than Ryan Williams, but in the game, I guess Ryan Williams has a higher strength rating. So it was kind of funny to listen to them go back and forth about that. They play the game a lot after class. They also talked about going to class, dealing with Alabama fans, kind of that whole day in the life thing. Ryan Williams told a funny story where I guess he was leaving the facility one day and there was a cheer camp going on somewhere and they all turned around and like rushed him as he was walking to his car. And then Mbakwe told a funny story where he like DoorDash, I think it was Wingstop, and the whoever was dropping off his food like stopped and talked to him for a minute because they recognized him as like an Alabama football player. So I don't know, like funny insights like that I think are what's gonna really help that podcast kind of pop. So that and just maybe funny stories here and there. And hopefully, I think maybe for our purposes, you hope that they bring you a little bit into the locker room or behind the curtain a little bit and kind of explain like plays or locker room dynamics or maybe share a funny story here or two. I don't know. That's what I'm looking forward to.
It's produced by the team, so I don't think they would go spewing off. Not that they would anyway, but like if there was anything that was a little bit edgy, like I don't think it would make it to air. But you know, I mean, we've never heard freshmen talk. Like I didn't even know like they had vocal cords. So the fact that two of them are doing a podcast is pretty remarkable, given the last 17 years here.
I do think from a pure business perspective, this would have been a genius move under Saban because freshmen were literally not allowed to talk under Saban. And then they launch a podcast. Like that's hits galore. Like that's, I don't know, like DeBoer's obviously a little bit different. We got to talk to Ryan Williams after the first game. I don't know, like the business mind in me is like, man, why didn't freshmen do this under Saban? Like I know they just recently unveiled the podcast studio, but that would have been really smart. I don't know, just my 2 cents. I wanted to use that as a way to launch. I'm kind of curious what you think about this, Mike. The proliferation, I suppose, of like Alabama football within sports media. This is something that Alex is actually working a story on. That's why he's not here on this show today. He got to go hang out with Nick Saban at his very first college game day for the 2024 season. I guess not his very first, but the first one in College Station for week 1 at least. Nick Saban's at ESPN right now. We've talked about Mark Ingram a little bit being kind of the star of Big Noon Kickoff on Fox. Damian Harris, another former Alabama running back, has kind of made his way into the media space, both with CBS, and I know he does some stuff with the Athletics college football podcast. We've also got Greg McElroy, who's a pretty prominent radio personality here in Alabama. Smoke Dixon does some stuff with Carl Reed with us at 24/7 Sports. What do you think about just the growing Alabama football presence within sports media?
Reese Davis too is an Alabama grad. Yeah, I mean, I think it usually happens that way where people who play for the bigger brands and are on that stage when they're a player tend to get more attention, in their post-playing career, where, the same thing was true when I covered the Patriots. Like a lot of Patriots players got into NFL media. I mean, very long list. Now Tom Brady is in TV while he's trying to be an owner. See how that goes. Not very well so far. But yeah, I mean, it's a very long list of Patriots players, a very long list of Alabama players. I think it's just the elevation of when you play for a team that's winning championships like that, people get to know you better. And people like us are talking about you more and writing about you more. And that helps. So, I mean, it's, I think it helps to have a good personality too. Like, I don't think it's just any player from those Alabama teams. I think you still have to be good for the platform, which McElroy is, which, John Parker Wilson was on the radio for a while. Tyler Watts is not a Saban player, but he is on the radio now. And then, it's Damian Harris, I think, has a personality for it. It's how it goes. You're not going to see too many Western Michigan quarterbacks on TV just because nobody knows who they are. So I think knowing who somebody is goes a long way. And I think that when you're at Alabama, people know who you are. And I think that goes a long way.
I think that makes sense. And I guess, I only got to spend 1 year covering a Saban coach team. And it's not that we didn't get to see a ton of these guys' personalities, but you could tell that like the media rules that Saban had in place, they were clamped down a little bit. And so when I think of guys like Damian Harris, I think of guys like Mark Ingram, like it really wasn't until they got to the NFL And maybe just because I wasn't paying attention more so in Damian Harris's case, once he got out of the league, did you really start to see these guys' personality shine a little bit? I know Mark Ingram was more or less a superstar for the Ravens and the Saints, and he had some really funny on-camera moments and really, I thought, pretty funny press conference moments with the whole big trust thing. It's kind of interesting to me that these guys, once they get out from underneath Saban's thumb, they kind of branch out and become those more personable figures. I don't know. Maybe that's just my perspective on things. You've obviously was covering this program for more, you covered Saban's program a lot more than I did. So I wasn't sure how you thought about that, but that just seems like what it was to me. As soon as they left Alabama, you really got to see their personality shine a little bit. And in the case of guys like Ingram and Harris, they are just very natural on TV, on podcasts. Like, these guys know exactly what they're doing, and I mean, exactly how to do it. Like, there's, I don't know. Sometimes people roll their eyes at like former athletes getting jobs that we kind of prepare for, or, go to school for, or, what we ultimately want to build into. And then you see a guy like Mark Ingram and Damian Harris do it, and it's just like, well, yeah, like, they're very good at it. Heck yeah. Like, we talked about the Kelsey brothers earlier. Jason Kelsey is going to be on ESPN this season for NFL coverage. He's going to be great at that. It makes a lot of sense for some of these guys.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't cover McElroy or Ingram. I didn't cover Damian Harris actually either. I missed him at all three of my stops. He has played for the Patriots, the Bills, and Alabama. I've covered him none of those places. Just been ships passing in the night. But I don't know who the next one would be, like, from the guys that I've covered. I don't think Bryce Young is. I mean, a lot of the guys I've covered at Alabama are still playing in the NFL. There's a pretty long list. But yeah, I mean, there's probably Tyler Booker from the current team. I think probably is the best shot. And I think he's very interested in doing that. I think he's getting a lot of opportunities to do that. The last few years, I mean, Will Anderson, honestly, he's going to play 15 years in the NFL. He's going to be in Canton, Ohio. But when he's done, I think he would be really good on TV. Again, it helps that people kind of know who you are. And Jordan Battle, I think, would be interesting. But
another name too that came to mind, and he kind of, I don't want to say he bucked the trend, but like, he was a guy that maybe we got to know a little bit more last season. Terrion Arnold, like, that's a guy who,
that's natural. Sorry, yeah, that makes sense. 100%.
Yeah. No, and I mean, he's a guy that's probably going to play a decade or more in the NFL anyway, but just because he's so freaking talented. But also, like, he's a guy that even in some of his press availabilities last year, he let us behind the curtain a little bit, talking to us about like the trash talk that goes on the field. He would not quite break down X's and O's, but at least explain it in a way to help us understand it a little bit more in depth. He launched this YouTube page. Like, he'd be great.
Mouse traps after the Kentucky game for rat poison.
There you go.
Trap game. That's what it was. It was for Saban's trap game.
Another name that came to mind, and it's only because he really said something. Malachi Moore is somebody that wants to kind of dabble in that space in some capacity whenever he gets done playing football. I know he eventually wants to go play on Sundays, and we'll see how long his career goes. But he even talked about, I think somebody asked him about Saban, and, because the first game day was week 0 in Dublin. So they were asking a handful of players, and Malachi Moore was just like, yeah, like, I was watching it. He's a natural. I was taking notes because that's something that I want to do. Booker, I think, is a good option too, just because like, he's gotten so many reps and he's given us a handful of really good sound bites. So who else do you think on this year's team, if you had to guess, could be a guy that could make the transition to media?
Yeah. I mean, Booker, I think, is the best at just putting together a thought and kind of giving a good answer to a question, and there's a value to that. I think, sometimes guys are just a little bit choppy in their answers. I think Booker's does it in a way that for TV, like, they love the 20-second answer that's tight and, it's very clear. So other guys on the roster that I can think of, and again, we're still getting to know some of these guys. Honestly, CJ Dupree, I've been impressed by. We haven't barely talked to him, but he just did a podcast with Learfield there a couple weeks ago, and he was pretty good and just kind of quietly very good. I was like, oh, okay. You never talked to him last year, I don't think. Maybe until
I don't think we talked. Maybe at the Rose Bowl, maybe.
And he's probably not a big enough name to really register, but my antenna went up listening to him. We don't know too many of these freshmen yet. I'm blanking on the other one right now.
Booker strikes me as interesting because I feel like, not that this is specifically an Alabama thing, but there's a lot of offensive linemen that have made the jump into media, right? Cole Kublik does a really good job, does a bunch of stuff with his radio show, his podcast. He does stuff on ESPN and SEC Network. Jason Kelsey, we mentioned him. ESPN, I feel like, has a handful of offensive and defensive linemen even that, are talking heads, whether it's college football or NFL. I like the Booker option. CJ Dupree, I've only talked to him, I guess, a couple of different times, but I've enjoyed the small bits of his personality that we've gotten to see. Same in the same tight end room. I think we've only gotten to talk to him once too, but Robbie Oots, it was a fun conversation the one time I got to talk to him.
Prototypical H-back.
He is the type of guy that Andy Reid would invite to his training camp, and he would be like the 55th guy on the roster.
I think he will get a look at an NFL training camp next year. I don't think he'll get drafted, but I think he'll be an undrafted free agent or a tryout guy.
I also wonder, and this is, again, probably we're going to get the opportunity to probably talk to him more if this season goes the way that we think it will, but Justice Haynes, I feel like, could be a guy that, similar to Ingram and Harris, I don't know, just something about Alabama running backs, I suppose. But he was the guy that I was just really impressed with the few times we've gotten to hear him talk throughout fall camp. I don't know if he's interested in it, but he's one that I could see like, okay, if he pursues this, I could see this happening.
Some of the wide receivers we need to get to know better. I think we've talked to Jeremy Bernard once.
Yeah.
Prentice, Emmanuel Henderson, Kendrick Law. Like, we need to talk to some of those guys some more, but we'll do that as the year goes on.
I don't know. Just thought it was kind of interesting. We can transition now to press conference availability takeaways. We got to talk to DeBoer, Kane Womack, and Nick Sheridan, head coach and both coordinators, on Monday for just kind of the final recap of Saturday's season opening win, and then just kind of the beginning stages of looking ahead to the week 2 matchup against South Florida. Wanted to touch on some injury updates. Caden Proctor, we learned this before the press conference, week to week with a shoulder injury. He may not probably play against South Florida, could potentially come back and play for the Wisconsin game. I think ultimately they want to have him ready for the Georgia game after the bye. What did you kind of take away from some of the comments? And also, I guess I'm kind of curious too, Mike, your thoughts on Elijah Pritchett's performance on Saturday. I don't know if you paid close attention watching live or close attention watching the replay, but was kind of curious that whole thing. We'll start with Proctor though.
I wouldn't rule out a dislocation, but I do think it's a situation where I don't think he's going to play this week against South Florida, but I think there's a good shot he plays against Wisconsin. And if not, you have the bye week after. So I think that would be enough time. Yeah, I wouldn't rule out a dislocation in that instance. But Pritchett's thin. That continues to strike me. Like, and it struck me last year when he played with Proctor in the beginning of the year. To hold up against SEC defensive lines, he's big. He has the frame, but he's slight, and it's just noticeable. Just having seen off, even like Wilkin Formby's a big dude. Pritchett's slight, and I don't think it really showed up in Western Kentucky. And you watched every snap, so I think you'd have a better idea of how exactly he showed up on each and every play. But that's the biggest thing to me is, like, physically, he's not in the same boat as Proctor or Formby. Just does not have the same body type and is thin. So, just being pushed around by an SEC defensive line is something that I would wonder about. And we saw a little bit of him in SEC games last year. Obviously, Proctor, even with his struggles, was still the guy that they chose. So that says something. And it feels like it's been a little bit disappointing for Pritchett, because it seemed like in the spring, like, he was there at left tackle and had the experience there. And then, Proctor comes back and you're thinking, all right, like, he just slides over to the right side and that's where he is. And I think there was even a thought of Kalen DeBoer playing Pritchett at left tackle. We saw that at the beginning of camp too. Like, if he has a good rapport with Tyler Booker next to him, why change anything? But then we saw Proctor kind of take over the left tackle spot a week into camp, and then Pritchett losing another competition to Wilkin Formby. And as a 5-star tackle in your second year, like, Wilkin Formby's not a blue chip player necessarily. He's, I think, showed pretty well to be where he's at, but you're not beating Orlando Pace at right tackle. So a little bit disappointing in general is kind of where I'm at with Elijah Pritchett. And again, I think there might have been higher expectations for him coming into fall camp than where he is right now, would be my guess.
He struggled early in the game, gave up a sack, the touchdown pass to Kendrick Law, when Milroe stepped up in the pocket, kind of towed the line of scrimmage and threw it, and Law did the rest. That play happened because Pritchett lost his rep. If you trust the PFF stats, it was not the best game from Pritchett. I'm willing to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt after spending basically all of fall camp preparing at right tackle and then having to switch during warmups before kickoff, like literally an hour before kickoff, to left tackle. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. After he struggled early, he kind of settled in and did fine, but it's also Western Kentucky. That's to be expected, especially out of a 5-star guy. It's funny you mentioned the size, because I think the same thing too, that Pritchett just looks a little smaller. He's listed at 6'6", 327. Formby is listed at 6'7", 324. So they probably just carry their weight differently. But just the way that when you talk about Pritchett, just 5-star guy, second year, or I guess maybe this is his third year, right? He's a redshirt sophomore.
Yep.
What's going on? I think back to fall camp, we got to talk to offensive line coach Chris Kapilovich a few different times, and he had made the comment, Formby is just very steady, very consistent. He understands what we want to accomplish on play to play as an offense. And to me, that screams, okay, maybe not a super high ceiling, but very high floor. You know what you're getting play to play. Whereas like Pritchett, there's a little bit wider variance, right? He's a 5-star guy. He's very talented. He can play with some of that nasty, but he could also goof up and have poor foot placement and not be able to hand fight properly and lose reps to guys from Western Kentucky. I think that consistency is more or less what won Formby the job at right tackle. And I think that's probably what's, even once Proctor comes back, I'm not sure that there's really a competition at right tackle because of that. I don't know. One man's opinion.
No, I agree. It seems like you're asking me who's starting against Georgia in 3 weeks. I think it's Proctor and Formby, unless something really goes wrong at Wisconsin. So, yeah, that's kind of where Pritchett's at. And it's going to be an interesting offseason at tackle, too, because I think you're going to have Ty Haywood coming in, who's a really highly recruited kid. You have Proctor for another year, unless for some reason he changes his mind and leaves again.
He could transfer.
You have Formby that, if he has a good year, I think maybe he's the incumbent at right tackle, but you also have some talented freshmen coming in. I think Pritchett's, if he doesn't start this year, is probably a candidate to transfer, just based on trends and what tends to happen there. I think Miles McVay and Naquil Bertrand are probably in that same category. So there's going to be some turnover, but your starters might be the same. It might be Proctor and Formby. So not to get too far down the road, but I think this is a big period of time here for Pritchett this next couple weeks to take advantage of some playing time that he gets and try to prove himself to be capable of starting over one of the guys out there.
Can more live reps help him? Or, now that he's probably going to spend the entire week getting those reps at left tackle, how much does that help them going into a game against South Florida? The other way down the road thought that I have, because he looks smaller, and I know that the actual measurements say otherwise, we're assuming Booker's going to be gone after this year. Same thing potentially maybe with Roberts. Could Pritchett benefit from a shift inside? Like, could he be a guard?
I don't think his body type is right. Just, again, looking at him, he's thinner. He's not look at him and Tyler Booker. They're very different body types. You kind of have to be a little bit squatter, to be a guard, just based on that position and what it tends to be. And he's more upright. He's thinner. He's longer. I don't think he fits that mold. I'm not Dante Scarnecchia, an offensive line expert, but that's just my opinion from watching football for a few decades here. That wouldn't make a ton of sense. He's actually one of the guys that fits more the tackle mold than the guard mold, which sometimes you really struggle to find a guy that fits the tackle mold. And I think that's probably why he was recruited where he was. It was just his frame. But I don't know if he's filled out his frame quite to the level that visually he looks like the other guys out there. It just doesn't, to me.
I'd like to see him on Saturday after a full week of getting those reps at left tackle, preparing to play left tackle, and not switching to that position an hour before kickoff. I wonder how big of a difference that would make. And that'll be one thing, obviously, to monitor against South Florida on Saturday. The other thing I wanted to get to on today's show, Nick Sheridan the offensive coordinator, detailed a little bit more of the headset communication issues from Saturday's game. You wrote about this, Mike, after the game immediately. We got a little bit more insight into it talking to these guys on Monday. The headset comms basically did not work at the beginning of the game. And the rule goes, I don't know that they work for Western Kentucky. And according to the rule, because they didn't work for Western Kentucky, Alabama could not use theirs. It sounds like they went in and out all throughout the game. So Nick Sheridan, who was going to call offensive plays from the box, was up and down basically all game. Like he would, leave the box to go down to the field during a handful of series, and then he would go back up to the box because the headset comms would work, and then they wouldn't work. So then he'd go back down. And, like there were times during the broadcast when I was rewatching the game where he's on the field and he's talking to DeBoer and they're trying to figure out what the game plan is. And to Sheridan's credit, he was very calm throughout the entire situation, or at least when cameras had him and DeBoer talking about it, where I'm not a lip reader, but I explicitly saw him say, it's fine. It's fine. Clearly it was fine. 600 total yards of offense, 63 points against Western Kentucky. But I feel like that's kind of a funny thing that maybe we are talking about enough, that like, oh, this cool headset comms thing that is going to, I don't know if it's going to like change the game, but it's going to be a fun wrinkle and subplot to the season. And then game one, like it just doesn't work and they have to adjust. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I've been a part of NFL games where that's happened that I can think of. And it's not typical in the NFL to have like signboards on the sidelines. It's become more common lately, but it's not like college where I think you can fairly seamlessly go back to that sort of system.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because this was a non-conference game. If you read the NCAA rule book, there's really no rule specific to failures about communications. It just says in the case of a failure for the coach's headsets, conferences can make their own rules. And the SEC rule book does include something about, equitable, if it goes down for one team, then it goes down for the other. But like any other SEC rule, like, travel rosters or whatever, like, or number of players you can dress or anything, I would think that only applies to conference games. And it was an SEC officiating crew. They probably knew that rule. The question is, did they apply it correctly to a game that wasn't between SEC opponents? And there's some thought that maybe they didn't. And, I don't know if it's worth a congressional investigation, but for a 63-0 game, but it's an interesting case study if that rule was correctly applied. And Kalen DeBoer, I think, was a little bit surprised and maybe angry too. I think on the TV broadcast didn't seem too happy about it. And he said it's the first time it's happened. And again, he's been in the Pac-12. He's been all sorts of different places. Like they may not have the same rules. But again, it's also a non-conference game. So I don't know if he was expecting that to be applied. So really, I think it's possible that it should have just been Western Kentucky's headsets go down and Alabama still uses theirs because there's no rule NCAA wise that would govern that. But again, this was not the helmet radios per se, which I don't know if you saw it. There's a picture of Western Kentucky. They charged them in their hotel rooms, like with an iPhone charger.
I did. I saw that. Yeah. All the helmets were lined up.
So I think this is what the NCAA was afraid of in adopting and not adopting this rule for so many years, that you have programs with lesser resources and not being able to necessarily handle the expense or a lot of the time and stuff that goes into maintaining these sorts of systems. But at the end of the day, this was not the helmets going down. It was the coaches' headsets going down, and it had to be multiple. Even the SEC rule says if it's just one headset, you're out of luck. It has to be multiple that go down in order to have the other team change their operations. So, it's one of those things that I don't think is going to happen again. I'm sure, South Florida would seem to have good resources, and obviously getting the SEC games, I think SEC schools are going to have it figured out. But I guess a good reminder on their part to have a backup plan in place if it happens. And it's probably something we're not going to be talking about again all season, but it was kind of interesting in the first few minutes of the season to have that come up.
My biggest question is like, we can put a man on the moon. We can beam a live sporting event on the other side of the world to our phones and watch it within a split second of difference live to actually when we're watching it on the screen. We can do all sorts of magical technological things. How do we screw this up all the time? Like, why is this not a more efficient process?
Not to be a conspiracy theorist, but when it first happened live, my first thought was, did Western Kentucky sabotage the system? Because think about it, you had Alabama all summer, practicing, thinking you're going to have a headset communication. And then all of a sudden, if they don't, you're kind of throwing in a variable that maybe evens the playing field a little bit. And again, that's just purely a conspiracy theory. But that was my first thought. I'm like, man, it actually kind of makes sense. Like we can just say our headsets go down and then Alabama can't use theirs. And That was, again, I'm probably wrong in assuming that, but that was my thought. And there's been, I remember, I covered the Patriots, man. Like, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories about what they do with
That's why
sideline.
I posed this question to you,
Right.
because you covered the Patriots.
Yeah, I mean, there's people who claim like the coaches' booths got fogged up because of some special system they put in, so the coaches can't see the field, and they've bugged the locker rooms, and there's all sorts of stories that come out of that place. And some of them might be true, some of them I think are tall tales, but there's obviously a little bit of a track record there. So it does raise the question of, like, things go down in an SEC, like, Alabama, Tennessee, like if the headsets go down in Knoxville, like Alabama fans are going to be saying, they're screwing with us here, Tennessee. So it does open the door for the conspiracy theories about sabotage and, other teams screwing things up in other people's stadiums. But I do think SEC games are going to be governed. Those systems will be controlled by SEC people. Or at least they should be. In the NFL, they are. All the coach to player communication systems are all NFL employees. So in theory, you should have a neutral third party, IT guy in charge of that. But I don't know that to be true in this particular case.
I just find it hilarious that we can do all sorts of things technologically now. And for whatever reason, radio headset communications is like a thing that we struggle with.
It was pouring rain before the game, so I don't know if water played a role there.
Maybe.
So I do remember covering a Patriots game that was, even worse, like downpour the entire game, and there was issues with headsets in that game too. Just, it was water everywhere, and water and electricity and all that electronics don't tend to mix very well.
That is another subplot that we'll continue to monitor as the season goes. Last thing I wanted to get to today, Mike, just kind of a quick whip around the SEC. We don't need to go game by game, but overall the conference went 13-3 in week 1. Any sort of interesting games or standout results or things that caught your eye when looking around at the rest of the conference in week 1?
Not really. I mean, I try not to put a ton of stock into it. Again, I think we mentioned the last show, like, people, this is the first set of data. Like, it's like election night, and you have Dixville Notch in New Hampshire coming in, and there's like 10 people there. Like, oh, 6 people voted for this guy and 4 people voted for the other guy. Like, this must mean something. And there's 300 million people in the country. So it's just the first data that we're getting. And so I think there's an inclination to look at it and analyze it more, with keeping in mind that there's several weeks of football to go here, to say the least. So I think it's safe to say Georgia's still good, but I don't know if that surprises anybody. I do think Clemson is maybe not as bad as they looked, and they held that game pretty close there for a little while. And then, Georgia pulled away 28 points in the second half. It was 6-0 at halftime. So I would wonder still in the ACC with Florida State, more data now that they are not all that good. Virginia Tech losing to Vanderbilt, like, is Clemson still? They still have a shot to win the conference. I don't think it's a crazy thought. You look at their schedule. North Carolina lost at Minnesota. Miami looked good, but that would, if Clemson beats Miami, then Clemson can still be a 3 or 4 seed in the playoff. But yeah, in terms of the SEC, I mean, Ole Miss, Auburn, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, they all did what they needed to do against bad teams, or inferior. Tennessee, talking 50, 60, 70 points in all those cases.
The biggest takeaway, I think, for me is, one, that nasty stretch at the end of Florida's schedule. Billy Napier might not be there to see it.
So. He's not going to be in October. Dude's it's not. He had to win this game. If you don't win games
early, even close.
Right. If he wasn't winning games early, he's not going to win them late. He's not going to be coaching them late either.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a very real possibility that Florida goes 1-11 or 2-12. I mean, look at their schedule, and that team could fall apart. But the correlation there is what happens to Ole Miss, because everybody knows Lane Kiffin's going to want that job. And the earlier Billy Napier gets fired, the earlier it becomes a distraction for Ole Miss. And if you have Ole Miss making a playoff and making a run, and he's coaching till January, like, I mean, if you're Florida, if you want him, then
right. If you're Florida, do you put all your eggs in that basket, or do you start
just dragging things out with an interim coach and going through a terrible season, and then you're waiting all the way through December with the portal open, and like that's gonna be a really interesting situation. Maybe Lane should just leave now and just resign and get ready to take the Florida job and coach them in October. Craziest thing, is that possible? I don't even know. Is that possible under rules? It probably is.
That's a good question. I don't know. I still consider myself an SEC newbie, so I'll sit back with a bowl of popcorn if it happens, just because I want to see what all transpires after that.
Personally, I would be all for what would happen as a result of that. Interim Ole Miss coach
Pete Golding.
I'm here for it.
I think the other things, or other, I guess, couple of things that stood out. Speaking of coaches that might be on hot seats, what do we make of LSU losing another season opener in a game which it looked like they probably should have won?
It doesn't bother me, to be honest, as much as people want it to bother them. I think especially in this format of a season, it doesn't matter a whole lot. I thought they played a competitive game. I don't think Garrett Nussmeier in the offense was as good as people were kind of overjoying themselves about during the game, but I think their defense was a whole lot better than last year. It just kind of had a bad string at the end there against USC, which like Lane Kiffin at USC, man, what year is this? With Lincoln Riley, like you'd expect like that offense to be good. So LSU,
I was going to say, for as many jokes as we crack about Lincoln Riley, the dude knows how to call an offense.
For many jokes we cracked about LSU's defense last year, they had a pretty good game. Yeah. So look, I would still think of LSU as a dangerous team. I don't think the loss, especially a non-conference loss like that, is really a huge deal in a 12-team playoff format. They lost 2 years ago in the 2022 season and they began against Florida State that year. They lost to Florida State by 1 point. And guess what? They beat Alabama. They beat number 7 Ole Miss. They go to the SEC championship game and they lose to Georgia. But in this format, they could go to the SEC championship game and make the playoff. So
right.
It's way too early to me to, who cares about the openers? Like, you care about the fact that Brian Kelly, his first year at LSU, won 10 games. Second year, he won 10 games. And I think has made that program something better than what it was under Coach O, with the exception of the Joe Burrow year. So I would not put the LSU to bed quite yet, and I still think that's a very dangerous game. Alabama going down there to Baton Rouge. I'm
not sure that I'm burying them, and then obviously the fact that Alabama's got to play that game on the road matters. But
I'm not saying you're burying them, but I've seen some stuff, man. I've seen some stuff like people making fun of Brian Kelly's my Boston homie.
Hey, former friend of the show, John Talty, former friend, still a friend of the show. We haven't really had him on. We might have to have him on to talk about the new book. We'll maybe check in on the bye week. But he wrote a very hot column for CBS about how, hey, this Brian Kelly, he ain't hacking it because of a third straight season opening loss, which I thought was interesting. But I also see what you're saying. Like it's a long season, and especially with the expanded playoff. Like even for as much as we want to throw dirt on Florida State, they're not even done yet. Like they probably are, just the way they've played the first 2 games.
Florida State going 0-2 in the ACC to start is bad for them.
Yes,
that makes it rough. LSU is 0-0 in the SEC, so that's good news for them.
The only other thing that really caught my eye, Vanderbilt's Diego Pavia balling out and the Commodores knocking off. What?
Of course it did. Of course it caught your eye.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I'm going to save that victory lap for when we get Scarborough back on the show on Thursday. It'll probably lead off the show. Spoiler alert. But that was really all I had for us today, Mike. We'll be back again Thursday. We'll get to discuss maybe a few more newsy items that we learned throughout the week, and then also start really digging into Alabama's week 2 matchup against South Florida. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 24/7 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 24/7 and 24/7 Sports. We are recording this on a Tuesday, which means today, I believe, is the last day to get 75% off an annual VIP membership to Bama 24/7 and 24/7 Sports. That's a whole year of VIP sports coverage for less than $3. Best deal all year. Please don't miss out. You can find a link to that in the show notes. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to you all again soon.